Why must young Americans toil and suffer and sometimes die in such a remote and distant place?
Blood on the horizon.
As soon as we got off the plane, they said, keep your head down.
We were all young kids, and I think we all had a John Wayne mentality. You have to get used to being rocketed or mortared almost every night.
Retreat does not bring safety.
There were demonstrations on campuses around the country. Our friends were going off to war and not coming back.
First night with the battalion, we got in the mortars, 18-year-old kids scared to death.
Americans have gone to far lands to fight for freedom. We have learned at a terrible and a brutal cost. And it is this lesson that has brought us to Vietnam.
After a century of French rule in Vietnam, local communist forces, along with foreign backers, finally ousted the French military. It soon became clear that the American-backed President Diem was Vietnam's best hope for democracy.
You have exemplified in your corner of the world patriotism of the highest order. You have brought to your great task of organizing your country the greatest of courage, the greatest of statesmanship. You are indeed welcome.
In support of democracy, President Eisenhower sent 900 U.S. advisors to Vietnam.
Mr. President, it is a great joy for me to be again in Washington, and a great honor to be welcomed by you. I thank you very much.
I was oblivious to Vietnam as a child. I mean, 14, 15 years old, there were a whole lot of other things going on. There was a lot of racial conflict. There were protests, all these types of things. You know, Vietnam took a backseat to me. And Vietnam really didn't become an issue to me until I joined the service.
I never thought anything about it. I was just, getting ready to turn 18, and before long the draft would be there. And I just decided to join the Marines and go to war.
We had been brought up by parents who knew World War II and the Korean War intimately. We grew up thinking that we had a sense of duty to our country.
Before I got drafted, everybody said, well, when you get drafted, we'll take off to Canada or somewhere. And I said, I wouldn't live. My dad killed me first,
During the 1960 presidential debates, Vietnam took a backseat to crushing home front issues. Through the election, most Americans were oblivious of the war on the horizon.
In the election of 1960, and with the world around us, we discussed tonight domestic issues. But I would not want that to be any implication to be given that this does not involve directly our struggle with Mr. Khrushchev for survival.
Shortly after John F. Kennedy took office, America suffered an embarrassing defeat to communist leaders at the Bay of Pigs. The need to defeat communism at every corner of the world increased, and in response, JFK deployed 16,000 troops to Vietnam. In 1963, President Diem's regime was not only fighting communist resistance, but an internal struggle within the country, especially the dominant Buddhist population. The South Vietnamese people began to rally against the government. Diem and his royal family's little compassion for the Buddhist monks who were burning themselves in protest furthered the divide between the South Vietnamese people and his American allies.
What have the Buddhist leaders done comparatively? The only thing they have done, they have barbecued one of their monks, whom they have intoxicated, whom they have abused the confidence. And even that barbecuing was done not even with self-sufficient means, because they used imported gasoline.
In the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them, we can give them equipment, we can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it, the people of Vietnam, against the communists. We're prepared to continue to assist them, but I don't think that the war can be won unless the people support the effort. And in my opinion, in the last 2 months, the government has gotten out of touch with the people.
As it became clear, the people of South Vietnam no longer supported the iron-fisted regime of Diem and his family. Kennedy became sympathetic to the idea of a coup. As Kennedy's support became known to Dean's opposition, his days became numbered.
Will you seek political asylum in this country if the coup is successful?
Never.
Why?
No, because I cannot stay in a country of people who have started my government in time of war.
On November 2nd, 1963, Dean was assassinated and a new chapter began in South Vietnam.
I tell you that if really the Moore family have been treacherously killed, in that affair it will be only the beginning of the story.
20 days after Dean's demise, America's beloved John F. Kennedy fell victim to assassination.
The greatest leader of our time has been struck down by the foulest deed of our time.
As the American people mourned, a new leader arose in Lyndon B. Johnson. As he came to lead America, Johnson vowed to defeat the communists no matter where the fight took us.
Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas and the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
As the new American leader became growingly angered at the brazen attacks on the U.S. Navy by the North Vietnamese, American forces fully implemented the strategic Hamlet program to relocate rural villagers to areas deemed easier to defend.
Well, we've got this strategic Hamlet program going on. When we go out on these operations, it seems like people are more friendly. Several times recently we've had people warn the Vietnamese troops that there was an ambush ahead or something like that. This means that people are getting on our side.
South Vietnamese allies on their own were also not able to secure the perimeters of bases housing U.S. forces. For the first time, American forces were in Vietnam as full combatants in the war for Vietnam.
7 days, no bombs fell on North Vietnam. During that time, we have made a most intense and determined effort to enlist the help and the support of all the world in order to persuade the government in Hanoi that peace is better than war, that talking is better than fighting, and that the road to peace is open.
After a failed attempt to broker peace, Johnson ordered the resurgence of bombing and continued military operations against North Vietnam.
Went over in September of '66, and when I landed in Vietnam, the first evening there, we got rocketed. They sent everybody, run into the bunkers. I went to 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. Nickname for 3-1 was the Ghost Battalion. The only time they activated was in time of war. And just as soon as the war was over, they shut it back down. First night with the battalion, we got mortars. So, I was starting to develop a pattern. I got rockets at the airport, and now mortars in at the battalion. 18-year-old kid scared to death. Christmas Day was when I got this Purple Heart. The battalion XO, Major Loggery, he decided that he wanted to survey his domain, so they picked 4 grunts to ride tank security, and we went out and rode around on a tank, with the major. He just out for a sightseeing tour. Somewhere along about noon, they decided he wanted to take some shots. He jumped out of the wood line and took a few shots at that tank. And I guess the tank commander thought, he'd just be a big shot. He turned the tank around. When he did, the only place you could get a shot off on that big rice paddy was one little old pile of dirt. He pulled that tank up on that pile of dirt, and when he let the tank idle down, it just kind of sit down. When it set down on 45-pound shaped charge. That was the end of the tank and a lot of things. Tank driver and gunner was killed instantly, and the tank commander, a second lieutenant, was just blood and strings from here down. Yeah, rest of us all, got shrapnel, but we lived, went on to, but that was my first real nasty experience. I mean, it was just, I think what scared me the most was when I landed in the rice paddy. I had the major and the other grunt come up there to see, check on me. When they raised me up, I remember, seeing blood all over the back of the major's hand where he, picked up the back of my head, and all I could hear was just that, like, a test pattern on a television. And it was, the first thing went through my mind, was I'm going to be deaf for the rest of my life, Not, I'm alive or anything like that, damn, I'm going to be deaf, Left out in October of '67. Luckily, my hearing started coming back. It wasn't all bad, wasn't all blood and guts. It was, there was good experiences over there, met good people.
I came here to speak to you about Vietnam. I do not have to tell you that our people are profoundly concerned about that struggle.
As the war raged on in Vietnam, the counterculture of the 1960s began to speak out against the war. For the first time in history, many Americans did not support our forces overseas. As the Vietnamese New Year of 1968 began, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong began the Tet Offensive. Hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers stormed several strategic bases and cities. The offensive did not succeed in taking the objectives. However, they did inflict many casualties and greatly reduced the American appetite for a war in Southeast Asia.
I was shipped out to Vietnam, and this is just before Tet in '68. So we got over there in '67, December of '67. Tet kicked in the first part of '68, and it seemed like it lasted the whole 12 months I was there.
Their attack during the Tet holidays failed to achieve its principal objective. It did not collapse the elected government of South Vietnam.
I ended up being assigned to security patrol or security police, where we did road patrols. There were times we were called out to go where there was high tension areas where there's a lot of Viet Cong activity. We called out to fill in spots to help out the Marines, the Army, whomever it was that needed assistance whenever there was a high concentration of Viet Cong. You have to get used to being rocketed or mortared almost every night and being pulled out of your bunk because there's incoming or gunfire all over the place. I remember also in April of '68 when Martin Luther King got assassinated, there was unrest among a lot of the black troops. And we were given orders to stay on base, and because they didn't want us carrying weapons at the time, they thought there was going to be some sort of insurrection within the troops between blacks and whites. And that probably gonna last about a week. I mean, after all, it's so long, but you can deprive us of weapons. We are in a war. We got through it. Again, our number one concern was the war that existed around us, the Viet Cong, protecting each other.
American opposition to the war increased as confidence in our government dropped. President Johnson's public support dwindled, forcing him to opt out of a re-election campaign.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Richard Nixon won the presidency with the largest margin in history, as he vowed to the American people that there can be peace with honor in Vietnam.
Having lost a close one 8 years ago and having won a close one this year, I can say that winning's a lot more fun.
Now let me begin by describing the situation I found when I was inaugurated on January 20th. The war had been going on for 4 years. 31,000 Americans had been killed in action. the training program for the South Vietnamese was beyond schedule. 540,000 Americans were in Vietnam with no plans to reduce the number.
They let us come home for 3 or 4 days before we went to Vietnam. As soon as we got off the plane, they said, get on these buses. And they said, keep your head down. All the buses had screen barbed wire on them because they said Vietnamese threw the grenades through the windows. The combat engineers, most of our jobs we did were clear landmines and clear roads and make it for the infantry to come in and everybody else. They were called roam plows. We made roads and cleared them, and then the heavy equipment came in and made the roads out of them. The scariest time, I think, was there. We were out in patrols clearing land, and it was like they'd always put napalm out there. Most of it was burned up. So we had we were clearing the land, and one guy up front, probably about 100 yards, hollered back and said, we found a tunnel. So the guy with me, the infantry went with the engineers a lot. He said, man, I want to see what's up there. He wanted to get a souvenir, a gun or something. He's on his 3rd tour and had 2 months to go. So he took off running up to the tunnel, and that's what he wanted. He tripped wire and blew from the waist up. And I was pretty far back, but it just blew blood all over me. I mean, from my body. And I had to go out, and chopper flew in, and they put him in the bag, just legs, a couple legs in one part, and the other part, the rest of his body. And you just had to be on your toes the whole time. And, but we had to do it. A lot of people say that they're an atheist, but I'll tell you what, there's no atheist in the foxhole.
More and more U.S. casualties began to mount. President Nixon was attempting to withdraw U.S. forces while increasing training of South Vietnamese troops, a process he called Vietnamization.
To protect our men who are in Vietnam and to guarantee the continued success of our withdrawal and Vietnamization programs, I have concluded that the time has come for action.
His decision to bomb Cambodia to sway the tide of war was ill-received.
In cooperation with the armed forces of South Vietnam, attacks are being launched this week to clean out major enemy sanctuaries on the Cambodian-Vietnam border.
In response to the new offensive, protests erupt across the nation, especially on college campuses.
In May of 1970, there were some demonstrations on the West Virginia University campus, basically anti-war demonstrations. There had been a lot of things going on immediately prior to that. There had been demonstrations at Kent State University, which had an absolutely tragic result. Some students were shot and died there. U.S. forces were conducting what was called the Cambodian Incursion. It was an effort by the United States to cut off the supply lines for the Viet Cong moving between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Students were agitated. They were agitated for a lot of reasons. The conflict was going on much longer than people had expected. More and more people were dying, which I don't think any of us had ever really expected. We were young, we were immortal. People don't die when you're in your early 20s or your late teens. And all of a sudden, our friends were going off to war and not coming back. I was in the advanced ROTC program, so I was curious about what was being said. The weather was beautiful. I had a little black and white film point-and-shoot camera, and I thought, I'm just going to go down and take some pictures about what's going on down there, and it just for my own records. I never really thought much about them. I brought them home, actually, developed them, put them in an envelope, and had pretty much forgotten that I had them until people started talking about the anniversaries of the Vietnam conflict, and they caused me to remember them. I pulled them out, I scanned them, and those are the pictures that I have now. The students were in two basic groups, the demonstrators and those who had come to, well, let's call them anti-demonstrators, the students who came to oppose the demonstrations. The students opposing the demonstrations were on the hillside and the retaining walls immediately above University Avenue. The demonstrators were in University Avenue and in Woodward Circle. There was much taunting back and forth between the two groups, but there was no overt shoving, pushing, fighting, at least not that I was aware of or that I've seen any record of since then. There was some throwing of objects, typically by the anti-demonstrators, consisting of some water balloons and some garbage. There was trash thrown back and forth. I stood with my camera in the middle of University Avenue. During the demonstrations, the Morgantown Police Force and the West Virginia State Police responded to try to keep order. I was taking pictures of students, demonstrators, the police. And I looked through the viewfinder on my camera toward the students, and I noticed that everyone was moving out of the street and onto the grass there on the campus at Woodward Circle. And I thought that was odd. Why was everyone moving? And I rotated while still looking through the viewfinder on my camera. And I noticed there was a West Virginia State Police trooper standing just a few feet away from me with a tear gas device spraying me with tear gas. And I thought, this is a good time to get out of the street, so I did. There was a lot of conflict, internal conflict in the students, in the community, and they wanted to be heard. They wanted to feel like they had a voice in all of this. That was the point of the demonstrations.
As the American public's disapproval of the war continued, Nixon's faith in Vietnamization grew. Nevertheless, in 1972, only half the number of U.S. troops were still in Vietnam as compared to 1969.
The path of Vietnamization has been successful. 2 weeks ago, you will recall that I announced that by May 1st, American forces in Vietnam would be down to 69,000. That means almost 500,000 Americans will have been brought home from Vietnam over the past 3 years.
As the vast majority of U.S. troops returned from Vietnam, Nixon agreed to a proposal that would bring home the remaining U.S. forces at the Paris Peace Accords. This strategy became known as Peace with Honor.
I remember getting off the plane. We were in, I think it was Clark Air Force, based up near San Francisco. We came in, and there were several coming through. There were like 3 or 4 of us. We were walking through the airport, and I remember passing by the hotel bar, and some guy was sitting at the bar, older gentleman. I mean, I was 19, I don't know what old was. He could have been 30, I don't know. But he invited us up to the bar to have a drink with us because he knew that we had just come from Vietnam, and he was celebrating us as soldiers, as warriors, the protectors of American freedom, I guess. I don't know what his thought was. But when I came back home, I had there's a lot of things I don't remember about coming back home, but I felt disconnected at first.
Sadly, as our heroes finally returned, they were met with hostility never before seen by returning U.S. forces. These men and women of honor who gave everything now faced an ungrateful nation.
Flew into L.A. International. While we were in L.A. International, there, you know, L.A.'s noted for the hippies anyway. While I was there, a fight broke out. You know, some hippies were running their mouth. And up there at L.A. International, all of the flights and the gates and everything's up on the 2nd floor, and the restaurants and everything's down in the 1st level. And what ensued was, you know, when the fight broke out, we started gathering up these hippies and throwing them over the rail down into the lower part. The cops come up there and rounded everybody up, and they looked at your ticket and found out, you know, where you were supposed to be. And they took us to our gates, housed us up at that gate like, dogs or something, until our flight left, so we wasn't allowed to leave that area. But that was my first experience with the anti-war group, and it was pretty pleasurable. I enjoyed it.
Got off the plane. Fights didn't really break out. They came close to it. They were calling us baby killers and all this stuff, and flew from Chicago, Charleston, and it was, nobody even knew what Vietnam was hardly. I mean, except we saw it on TV.
As America stayed true to their word in the Treaty of the Paris Peace Accord, the North Vietnamese advanced despite their promise of peace. The result was the fall of Saigon in 1975 and the collapse of democracy in South Vietnam.
A vast human tragedy has befallen our friends in Vietnam and Cambodia.
The most sickening thing was when the war ended in '75. I remember watching that on TV. And I got sick at my stomach. My stomach was knotted. Just, I just thought all the people that had died for nothing, and we went over there to befriend these people, don't worry about it. We'll take care of you. We're going to protect you. And we just, left them, turned them over to the mercy of people that had no mercy, and they were just left to be slaughtered, men, women, children.
I wouldn't want any more deaths or even people get killed, but I think it's a really good experience. It helped me to really, enjoy life more.
I just felt separated from stuff. And when the Vietnam War was over with, I don't think I had any particular feelings about it.
Even as the extreme challenges of the Vietnam War claimed untold U.S. lives and sacrifices, today America and history finally give these heroes the respect and dignity they deserve, and we will always remember them among America's greatest warriors.